All right, thanks so much. Hi everyone. My name's Erik. Um, so to get started, I wanted to highlight today that the resources we put together were part of a collaborative effort from the Cobra DRM core. The purpose of putting together these resources was to address one of our core aims, which is to provide direct support on best practices for censoring equity throughout all stages of research. This
Yeah. Oh, I don't working.
So to ground ourselves a little bit before we get started, I did want to note that it's important as a research community that we raise the bar when it comes to preventing overdose death, specifically in Rhode Island. Prevent Overdose RI has published findings through 2024 that highlight that Black Rhode Islanders experience a higher rate of overdose deaths than both Hispanic and white Rhode Islanders. In correlation to that, Prevent Overdose RI also highlights that Black Rhode Islanders receive methadone far less than white Rhode with just that very quick little bit of local context in mind, we also wanted to highlight that it's important to look at how race and ethnicity data have been historically measured across the US. The first census was established in 1790 and only included three different race categories. It took until 1977 for those first standards for race and ethnicity data collection to be established. Those standards were then not updated till 20 years later in 1997. Of note, though, that those 1997 standards don't include representation for folks from Middle Eastern and North African. 25 years later, it was announced in 2024 that the revisions listed here on the screen would be implemented. Those revisions include combining race and ethnicity into one question, adding representation for folks from Middle Eastern and North African countries, removing stigmatizing words such as majority and minority, and the addition of detailed data collection beyond the minimum standard. These changes were to be reflected across government surveys, forms, and the US Census with a proposed implementation timeline of about 18 months. Now, with the change in administration and the resignation of the director of the Census Bureau in January, it's a little uncertain if the changes will still be taking place. But I do want to highlight that there are still 5 more years before the 2030 census, and there'll be a test in 2026 and 2028 happening before that. The changes were actually open to public comment until this past Tuesday. So the next step will be that the Census Advisory Committee will be reviewing the changes in April. If you want to stay up to date on what changes might be happening, I posted the link here for reference. So with both the DRM core aims and a little bit of context in mind, we put together a library of resources specifically focused on equity and data. Here on the screen, you can see I posted the QR code if you'd like to access the library now. If not, it'll be posted again at the end of the slides, and also there's a hyperlink for when the slides are sent out. So the resources in the library range from articles, toolkits, and webinars to provide both a mix of mediums and engagement level. The resources are broken down into 5 different categories, which include the data lifecycle, best practices, evaluation, visualization, and dissemination. On the following slides, we're going to go through an example of each of them. So one example in the data lifecycle category is the Racial Equity Throughout Data Integration Toolkit from the AISP. This toolkit includes 6 comprehensive chapters, starting with planning and then going through the phases you see listed here all the way to dissemination. Each chapter includes guiding questions, positive practices, and a real-life example of the work in action. Outside of the 6 chapters, there's also 3 different activities that a researcher can complete. Activity 1, who should be at the table, helps outline how researchers can identify, assemble, and gather a group of diverse stakeholders. Activity 2 mapping assets and engaging the community helps researchers develop an understanding of the local context. And activity 3, identifying root causes through factor analysis, helps researchers to identify factors and causes for observed outcomes in administrative. So as I mentioned, there's 6 different chapters covering the data lifecycle, and here you'll find an example of those positive practices from each of those chapters. On the left side of the screen is the default practice, and on the right side of the screen is the recommended practice from the resource. So for planning, the recommendation would be to establish deadlines that prioritize participation from community members. For collection, the AISP recommends having role-based staff that are trained in data collection. And for access, the recommendation is to have both transparent data release schedules and clear information on where data can be accessed. For statistics, the recommendation is to provide transparency in the design of the algorithm and testing process. For analysis, they recommend engaging local experts. And finally, for reporting, the AISP recommends creating a range of different products. So now we're going to shift one of our resources for best practices. The University of Illinois has established a guide for best practices. The first best practice is to thoughtfully consider race and ethnicity during study design. This may include indicating how race was measured and any limitations there were, such as were participants asked to self-identify. The second best practice is to treat racism as a fundamental cause for health inequalities when choosing methods and interpreting results. And the third is to acknowledge intersectional identities. So this may look like examining race at the intersection of gender, class, citizenship, and sexual orientation. A second best practice that I wanted to highlight was from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and they put together a roadmap. This roadmap is a 1-page infographic, so it's pretty easy to digest. And here I've highlighted just 2 of those key points. There are 7 key points that are highlighted in the roadmap. Next, we have a resource for evaluation, which is the Racial Bias in Data Assessment tool. This tool can be used to assess the risks of bias in a survey data set before conducting secondary analysis. This tool includes 25 different questions that are focused on design, approach, and data structure. I've included one example on the right side of the screen here. This particular question prompts the researcher to think about the implications of any geographic boundaries that you may have in your research. And then after answering the 25 questions, the researcher will reflect on an assessment of low, medium, or high risk of bias. Based on that risk, the tool will then provide a practical consideration for your research. A second resource for evaluation that I wanted to highlight is the guiding questions for supporting culturally responsive evaluation practices from the MDRC. This resource is an article that offers guiding questions throughout multiple phases of research. A few of those phases include project design, cost analysis, data collection, and data analysis. Here on the screen, I've included a short sample of some of the qualitative questions. In addition to these questions, the article also highlights that an equity-based perspective challenges us to go a step further and examine what projects we pursue and what questions we're asking. Next, we have a resource for visualization. Throughout this article, the author notes that we should all be considering language, colors, icons, shapes, and order within our research. For language, it's important to consider how we're using titles, text, and labels. For both colors and icons, it's important to follow contrast and accessibility guidelines while also not using color palettes that may reinforce gender or racial stereotypes. On the right side of the screen here, I've shown you an example from the article of how the colors have been updated from figure 2 to figure. When considering order, the Urban Institute recommends taking an active role when choosing how data labels appear within visualizations. This can apply to labels in tables, bars, and graphs. The article highlights that which group we show choose to show first can affect how readers perceive the relationship or hierarchy between different groups. So a few of the recommendations from the author are listed here on the screen, which include considering which community is the focus of your study, considering what story you're trying to tell is, and finally considering the relationship between your groups when it comes to population size, sample size, and your group. Last but not least, we have a resource for dissemination, which is the steps towards distributing data products equitably by Lee Al Kao. This resource highlights that what you say, how you say it, and how your audience interacts with it matters. This principle is highlighted through 3 key steps within the resource. The first step is to choose a target audience in a way that reflects the equity that you aim for. The second step is to review your content, medium, and access, which we'll go into a bit more on the next slide. And the third step is to test out a variety of styles, mediums, and narratives directly with your target audience. So listed here on the screen are some of the examples from the content, medium, and access topic. So for content, you might want to consider what the subject of your content is and what tone you're using to tell your story. When thinking about medium, you may want to consider if your audience interacts more with a digital or a printed work, and if there'll be any interactive elements to that work. And for access, you'll want to consider factors such as, does your audience need to pay to see your work, or do they need to create an account to log in? So now that we've gone through a quick example of each of the resources, I do want to note that there are webinars also included in the library. These webinars are free to access via YouTube or Vimeo, and they're each about an hour. Before wrapping up, I did also want to highlight that there is an upcoming talk in the Racial Equity and Methodology series. This talk will be held virtually on April 17th at 12 p.m. with Manuel Cano. And if you'd like to register for the event to get the Zoom link, you can do so at events.com. I also want to note that if you have any questions about this resource library, or again, if you need the link, you could reach out to me or Julia and put our contact information here on the screen. And then finally, again, here is the QR code if you didn't catch it the first time. And then when the slides are sent around, we also have QR or the links if you want.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Any questions for her? Again, if there's any online. In the chat.
And just one last comment that I'll make is that this library is kind of considered like a living library. So we're always considering new articles, webinars, or journals to add.
Thanks again.